Rosie, for the intro, and thanks so much everyone for joining us today. Just to echo Rosie's comments about how lovely it is to see people, I think literally from all four corners of the globe today. As you know, the topic is navigating British business culture. It's a huge topic. We do run full-day programs on the topic, but I'm hoping today to give you a flavour, to give you a little bit of a taste of some of the key elements of what makes us tick, who we are and how we prefer to work. The focus is on the business side of things. And I think for a lot of people it's the communication that can be quite challenging. One of the things we always say is intercultural training goes beyond language. So you might speak fantastic English, as I know many of you do, but that's not always enough to really understand how to work effectively with people from another culture. Rosie mentioned that it's going to be interactive. So what I'd like to do now is just to find out a little bit about you all. It's quite a small map of the world there. You can see, I think some of you found them already, but there are some drawing tools on the left of your screen. You should have that grey toolbar. You can either take the drawing tool and mark a cross wherever you happen to be in the world today, or if it's easier, you can take the T for text and you can just write the name of the country or the city where you are, or if you want to just stick to the chat, that's your third option. But it would be lovely to see, I know some of you have shared already, but it would be great to see the breadth of cultures and countries that we have represented today. So we've got a few people in Europe, so I can see someone's put Hanover, we've got India, I think that might be Taiwan, that red arrow, but I'm not 100% sure. I think we've got a few in Latin America, South America there. Is that Brazil? Lovely. And I think the reason I do this is partly curiosity. I'm an interculturalist, so I'm very interested to learn about your cultures. But I think it's also interesting to know that depending where you are in the world, you might see the UK differently to each other even. There are a lot of commonalities, which I'm sure you all have observed. But an interesting experience I had a couple of years ago, I was working with a group of expats one day from the north of Europe, I think predominantly Germany, and they said that they found the need to make small talk here in the UK very challenging, very difficult, unnecessary even. But then the next day, literally, I was working with a group of people from Latin cultures, so South Americans, Italians, Spanish and so on. And their complaint was that the British people don't make small talk. So I heard literally within 2 days very conflicting perceptions, observations about what British culture is and what the behaviours are. So do bear in mind that maybe some of the things I say today might not even resonate with you, but hopefully there will be some common themes that we all can agree on and we've all observed. So thank you for doing that, and great to see such a diverse range of cultures here with us. Hopefully that will make the conversation a bit richer as well. So my second question to you is, what's your experience, what's your connection with the UK? So there's a couple of things that I'd like you to play with me, if you would. So there is a poll that you should be able to see. Hold on one second. There we go. You can tick 1 or 2 or 3 or none of these, but I'd just like to have a sense of what your experience, what your relationship is with the UK. The other thing that you could do, if you would like to, is to mark on the map where you are, if you're in the UK, or where you visit, if you come here regularly. Perhaps you work for a British company, where's their headquarters? So what parts of the UK are you connected with? Not surprisingly, I'm seeing a focus around London, but I'm sure, oh, interesting, someone has a connection with the Republic of Ireland, or perhaps they're there. But it's looking at the moment like most of you, I spoke too soon. Great. So right up as far as Edinburgh, we've got Birmingham. Lovely, thank you. And let me just share the results of that poll with you. So you should now be able to see, actually, the majority of you, it's virtual. So I think with time and money often in short supply in today's working world, I'm not surprised to see that for most of you it's a virtual connection. And that can be more challenging because you don't have the eye contact and the opportunity to spend time socially with your colleagues. We do have a few Brits on the call, so I'll be interesting to hear your observations. And then we've got quite a few people living here, others who travel regularly, and some that work for British companies. So a nice mix. So thank you for doing that with us. And again, the reason I've asked where you are is that probably like most countries, most cultures, the UK is very much a culture, a country of many cultures. I'm sure you're all aware that we're actually 4 nations within a country. We're England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. But there are other divides. People talk a lot here about the North-South divide, and it's even true of living in London. I'm a South Londoner, and I have a lot of friends who perhaps don't like to come and see me because they have to cross the river. Now, it's partly our sense of humour, but it's also that sort of regional identity coming to the forefront as well as the nationality. And I think, I'm sure you're all following the news at the moment, and I really don't want to talk about Brexit. I'm not sure if, things are changing every day, so probably something's changed in the 10 minutes since we've been on the webinar. But I think one thing I will say about that is that it's the last 2 years since the referendum, the debate that we're having and the negotiations, it's really highlighted some of the divisions that we have in our society. And whether that's geographical, there's also a big divide, I think, now between the urban and the rural communities, the university educated and the non-university educated, those that work in certain industries, those who work in business, those that don't. So it's something to be aware of, as I'm sure you very much are, but in your conversations, your interactions with your British colleagues, you will find people want to talk about it, but also it can be a very, very divisive topic of conversation. So tread lightly when you are talking, and you'll be aware where in the UK you are, perhaps what the feeling is and how you approach that conversation. But I think, the differences are nothing new, and those of you who've travelled around the UK will be aware of these kind of very visible, audible differences. So we have different accents. We use our language differently, so the colloquialisms, the idioms, the sense of humour even. I have a lot of family in Liverpool, in the northwest of the UK, of England, and there they have a great sense of humour, but they don't use the smile to show that they're joking. So it can be quite challenging for people that aren't familiar with that. And our lifestyle can be a bit different. The time we have lunch, for example, tends to be later in the north of England than it is here. But I would say, while there are these differences, and we do have the micro cultures throughout the UK, we tend to work in broadly similar ways. So the things that I'm going to go on to talk to you about in terms of management styles, business behaviours, yes, there will be differences if you're in Birmingham rather than London, if you're in Edinburgh, not Cardiff. But very broadly speaking, we do business in similar ways. So just to kind of set the scene there in terms of the many cultures of the UK. So I know you all have a lot of experience already, so I'm going to give you the floor again and just ask you to give me the first word that comes to mind when you think of the British. How would you describe us? And feel very free. We're very tough-skinned here, so feel free to make it a negative word if you'd like to. But either use the text and write in the box, or you can use the chat if you prefer. Oh, quirky, that's nice. I'll just give you a moment. So we've got some cultural references as well, Monty Python, there was something else, the Beatles I saw, polite, that tends to come up a lot. Well, you're all being very polite, I must say. I'm not seeing anything too negative. Indirect communication. Graceful, interesting. So there are some themes, I think, coming up. I like that, phlegmatic. Someone be brave and give me a negative impression. Witty, that's nice. So the indirectness is definitely a theme. Brexit, of course. Educated, that's interesting. I guess we have our reputation of Oxbridge universities and so on. Diversity. Well, thank you. I can see there's a real richness of ideas and concepts coming through. The reason I was interested to hear the negative actually was two reasons. I was at an event the other day with another intercultural consultant who said that he's asked this question many times in many countries around the world, and the word that comes up time and time again is hypocritical. And that surprised the audience, but then I think thinking about it, I felt maybe I could see where that was coming from. Yes, and I can see it is there somewhere, so someone obviously is thinking on those lines. When I've asked this before, the word that often comes up is passive-aggressive, which is embarrassing to say out loud. But I think when we go on to talk about our communication style, maybe we can link back. And I think the way we communicate perhaps gives this perception. And what I want to do now is link through to stereotypes, because often we have an image of a culture, a country, and it may be based on very limited experience. It may be based on a movie from 20 years ago. It may be that kind of glossy picture box image that's not the reality. But when we haven't spent much time in a culture, that's what we have to go on. And just to show you some images, and I think this is probably in many parts of the world the typical stereotype of particularly the English, maybe not so much the British, that kind of middle class, upper class, well educated, tennis playing, tea drinking, very traditional type of Brit. You know, they live in a house like Downton Abbey. They have a good job in the city in an investment bank. Now, personally, I know probably nobody, very few people who actually meet this stereotype. I don't know if in your dealings with the Brits you've met many people that represent this. I'm not sure. But we do also have the other extreme when it comes to stereotypes, as we do with all cultures. You have the poorly educated, the fish and chip eating, beer swilling, football watching stereotype. And again, I don't know if I know anyone that really matches that stereotype. So we do need to be careful sometimes when we're labeling cultures that we work with. There is some truth in stereotypes, of course. I mean, the last picture on this slide is the British queue. There's a lot of truth in this. We do love to queue, and I might talk about that a bit later. But bear in mind that your images, your impressions, your stereotypes may have some truth, but when you're interacting, when you're working with your colleagues here, when you're perhaps doing some research, try and dig a little bit deeper, ask questions, go beyond the stereotype and try and find what really does make us tick, and it may surprise you. So I have some more pictures for you, and I'd just like you, before we do the pictures, let's have a look at some key themes, because I think one of the things when we look into a culture is trying to understand the values. We had on our objectives what makes us tick. And that the crux of this really is our values. And those can be personal as well as cultural. But what's important to us? But before we understand the values, sometimes looking at some of the themes within a country can help us to understand where some of these values come from. So I think you all know the UK is an island. We saw the map. You've been here. What does that mean? I mean, one thing is we haven't been invaded. Well, do you know? Can I ask you that question? When was the UK last invaded by another country? When did we have soldiers from another country on our land? Does anyone know? Can anyone be brave and hazard a guess? 1066 is what most people think. And broadly speaking, that is the correct answer. But when I was researching this topic a while back, I discovered that it was actually in 1797, French soldiers briefly landed on the coastline of Wales. But I think it was over in several days. So the history books will probably tell you that 1066 with the Norman conquests. So we're an island culture. We're in some ways quite closed, quite protective of our island. It's hard to invade, it's hard to get here. Now, what does that mean in terms of our values? We're quite individualistic. I said I wouldn't talk too much about Brexit, but even when we were part of the European Union, we had a lot of exemptions. We vetoed a lot of the changes. We were slightly different. We didn't adopt the currency, for example. We drive on the other side of the road to everyone in Europe. So we like to be different. I think there's an impression about British culture that we conform, and we do to a certain extent. We like to play by the rules, but at the same time we do like to be different. We'll break the rules when our sense of fair play isn't affected. So I think the UK, when you look at some of the cultural research that's taken place, is one of the most individualistic cultures in the world. And this leads to that slight eccentricity. I think some of you mentioned things like the Beatles and Monty Python. For those who don't know, Monty Python was a group of male comedians back in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, and their sense of humour was very different to anything that had come before. And this also translates in our sense of fashion, perhaps some of the architecture, the way we operate, what makes us tick. I think there's a lot of eccentricity, a desire to be different and stand out. Now, we're also a crowded island, and again, this is all relative. There are some mega cities which are much more crowded than the UK is, but I think London is probably now the second or third most crowded city in the UK. Our population density, I have it written down for you, is something like 420 people per square kilometre. So again, what does this mean? We like our privacy, we like our personal space, we like to get home in the evening, close the doors, perhaps not let anyone in. I've heard a lot of expats complain that they try desperately to get to know their neighbours. They feel like they're making progress, but the invitations never really come to fruition. It's very hard sometimes to get an invite to a colleague or a neighbour's home. So don't be disheartened if you're not invited to the neighbours in the first few weeks or months, or quite honestly years sometimes. And this does mean we're reserved. You know, we take time to get to know. We don't talk to people typically in the street, on the underground and so on. We like to keep ourselves to ourselves, initially at least. And I think from this comes this veneer of politeness, and I would like to talk longer about this, but we don't have huge amounts of time. But I think politeness is a very abstract term. We're seen as polite because we use a lot of please and thank you, but I would question whether that actually makes the British more polite than any other culture. But we're superficially, or on the surface, very polite. Please and thank you, sorry, excuse me, really matter here. And we have a lot of weather in this country, and that gives you great opportunities for small talk. We like to make our small talk through grumbling, and we have a lot of weather to grumble about, so that can be really helpful. We make relationships often by complaining about the small things, so the rain, the cold, it's too hot sometimes. And then we are a nation of sportsmen, of sport. And again, this need to play by the rules sometimes. One of our values, I would say, is fair play. When it's translated to the workplace, there's a very strong sense of equal opportunities, making sure everyone has the chance to, whether it's be promoted, work on interesting projects, but there are opportunities for everyone. But we do, at the same time, abide by the rules of the game. And I think someone mentioned in the previous exercise that we are a very diverse nation. I think certainly here in London, every nationality, every language is recognised and heard in the streets, in the schools now. I put the question mark against tolerance now. I would have 5 years ago definitely said this was a core value, but again, with the current political climate, I think it needs to be questioned a little bit. And I think one thing I find interesting about the British culture is the way we have tradition and innovation living very much side by side. Some of you mentioned in the brainstorming the tradition, the monarchy. We saw the pictures of the guy with the tennis racket and the cup of tea. We love our traditions here, but it's also a country of innovation. You may be familiar with the Old Street roundabout in London, where many startups are based. We have Silicon Fen in Cambridge, for example. It's very easy in the UK to set up a new business. You can become self-employed within 24 hours. While sometimes people complain about the bureaucracy here, it's actually very straightforward to innovate, to become self-employed, to set up a new business. We're perhaps more comfortable with change than you might imagine. When you think of the stereotypes, particularly of tradition, monarchy, class, and so on. And I think this has an impact on, I think someone used the word pragmatism in the exercise, but we are very pragmatic. We do plan, but we plan just in time. So we're good at the short-term planning, but we're not a culture of long-term planning. And often good enough is good enough. We're perhaps not a culture of perfectionism. So I'd like now to move on and really start to look at the workplace preferences and dig a little bit deeper here. There's just a couple of quotations there when I've reached out to British colleagues and asked what they appreciate in their managers. This is very typical of the kind of response that I've heard. Excuse me, but just a couple of kind of key points to share with you. I think different to certainly many of our European colleagues, our sort of French, Spanish, Italian colleagues, managers in the UK tend to be generalists. You don't need to be an expert to be a good manager. You don't need to have been there and done it yourself. An interesting point was made at the event I mentioned recently that if you look at our recent chancellors of the Exchequer, the people that look after the country's money, the current chancellor, Philip Hammond, he's very well educated, but he studied PPE at Oxford. So he studied politics, philosophy and economics rather than pure finance. But you might say, but he's still, you know, he's from the old guard, he's Oxbridge educated. But then I thought of a previous chancellor about 10 years ago who'd made his career as a postman, a trade unionist. He hadn't gone to university. He left school at 16, but then in his 50s, he became Chancellor of the Exchequer. There are many parts of the world where that would never happen. So it's looking at the experience much more than the qualifications here, looking at the management skills rather than the engineering or the financial or the design skills. It's how do you bring your people together and get the most out of them rather than necessarily leading from the front by example. And I think, again, perhaps a surprise to some people, but we are a fairly informal culture, particularly when it comes to work. It's very relaxed. Our CEO here, who I think is on the call with us, he has lunch with everyone in the restaurant every day. He doesn't sit at his own special table. It's very democratic in most British organisations. First names, knock on the door whenever, often the boss will be in the open plan office with everyone else. It's not a formal structure. And again, managers tend to, obviously there are always exceptions, but the British manager will typically leave you to it. You know, don't be surprised if it's quite hard to get FaceTime with your manager. It doesn't mean they're not interested. It doesn't mean that they don't think well of you. They just assume that you're getting on with it and you're doing a good job. And I guess key things if you are managed. I mean, let's have a show of hands. I don't know, can you see at the top of the screen you have a little person with their hand up? Could I ask you to put your hand up if you are currently managed by a British manager? That would be really interesting to see. So a few of you. Great, thank you. There's about a dozen of you who've said yes to that, so it'd be interesting maybe in the chat or in the questions to hear your experiences, and feel free to disagree with anything I say if it's not your experience. Can I ask one, if you can take your hands down, so click the little person again, can I ask you if you're a non-British manager managing British people? So fewer people, but there are a few of you as well, so thank you. And I recognise the names, so some of you are almost in a sandwich. Your manager's British, you're not, but you also manage people that are British. And I think as managers, we need to understand what the expectations are, and equally, if we're being managed, we need to understand what's expected of us. But I think if you are managed by a British manager, key things that you would need to be aware of are the need to speak up, speak out in meetings, make suggestions, help with decision making, disagree, challenge. Those are all qualities which are admired rather than disapproved of in a British setting. So don't be afraid to disagree, to question things that come from the top down. It's expected rather than disapproved of. I'm just looking at the chat to see if anyone's disagreeing, but hopefully that's your experience as well. And yes, the final point, it's very much about show me the results. I don't necessarily need to know how you get there, but I want to see what you've done. So don't talk to me about problems, don't talk to me about processes, give me the results. So when it comes to meetings, I'm sure it's true in your cultures, your countries, but meetings tend to dominate the British workplace. And a question for you, perhaps in the chat, what makes a good meeting? Because I think this is a key part of our intercultural work, that we assume that what is good is the same for everybody, what is normal is the same for everyone. And we discover often to our cost that it's not. Normal has many different meanings. So lots of answers, wonderful. Good preparation, structure, compact, effective, win-win. Lovely, short and call to action, so you need an agenda. So there are some common themes coming through, but differences as well. Brief, I would agree with that one. Courage, can I ask Hans-Peter if you would elaborate? I think I can imagine what you mean, but tell us more about courage in meetings. My assumption is you're talking about, yes, bringing in ideas, but speaking out, challenging. Yeah, lovely, thank you. So wonderful, thank you for all your contributions and ideas. I would say, and again, feel free to disagree with me, in the UK, meetings have a purpose of agreeing actions and making decisions. Someone said the shorter the better. That's the sign that meetings aren't great in your organisation, I would say, if you want them to be short. Good meetings should be a really positive part of the working day, and I appreciate that often that's not the case. So what's a British meeting like? I think in theory at least, it's about actions and about decisions. Not always the case. And again, just a few pointers. Again, one of the stereotypes of the British is that we're overly punctual, always on time. I would say yes, if you're going to a meeting with British colleagues or you're meeting a British client for the first time, being late would not be a good look. But we tend to be just in time. We're not there 10 minutes beforehand. We're not, dialing into the call half an hour before, as many of you very kindly did. It meant we were able to start on time. You'll find people are dialing in at the time the meeting starts, but do your best to be on time. We do break the ice at the beginning of the meeting, so there is a little bit of small talk. People might share something interesting about their work or their life. There might be a little bit of banter, as we say, some humour just to break the ice. And I think that is a big difference between the UK and many other cultures. I think sense of humour is universal, but using humour in the workplace isn't. And it's very much okay here in the UK to make jokes in the workplace, particularly when there's conflict. If you need to break the ice, if you're not sure what to say next, humour always comes in handy. A few of you put structure, and yes, there is a structure to most British meetings. We do have an agenda, normally circulated in advance, so people can prepare and be ready to discuss the themes, but it is informal. So we do sometimes go off message, but the chair will bring people back to the agenda normally. As I said before, actions and decisions are expected. And just linking back to the previous slide, there is an expectation if you're in the meeting that you speak, that you contribute. It's your chance to shine, to build your reputation, as I've said here. It will be noticed if you're in an hour's meeting and you say nothing. So be prepared, be ready to have something to say, to be able to contribute, rather than to sit in silence for the duration of the meeting. So I think this is a challenge, particularly for those of you who come from very relationship-focused cultures. How do you build your relationships with the Brits? How do you get to know them? We do value relationships. We do value other people and enjoy the relationships that we have with our colleagues, our partners. I'm sure those of you who have worked with the school know that we are a very relationship-focused organisation, but I'll come back to this. Relationships take time here in the UK, so don't give up, don't force it, don't think that nobody likes you if you haven't been invited out for dinner in the first week. It takes time, but it will come. We do like small talk, but it does need to be small, i.e., excuse me, not too controversial, not too long, and not too personal. Excuse me, it's that time of year here in the UK where everyone seems to have snuffles and coughs and colds. Someone's ahead of me with the peach and the coconut, thank you. So I think this is universal rather than British specific, but try and find common ground. Things you have in common, whether it's a sport, whether it's your children, something you've done at the weekend. But I think perhaps what's more specific to the British culture is this idea of finding the small things to complain about, these common grumbles. I've made really good relationships with neighbours when the trains have been cancelled and we've all been on the platform moaning and groaning about the terrible train service. It's very, very typical. And I think the other thing, particularly if you are an expat here in the UK and building personal and professional networks, take opportunities to go to networking events, make connections with people, introduce people, ask for introductions. I think this links back to our kind of old school boys networking type tradition. We do a lot of networking, particularly here in London, I think. So take advantage of those opportunities. So let's look at our peach and our coconut. Before I explain, actually, let's do a quiz. I'll leave it to your imagination to try and work out what the differences between a peach and a coconut, and I'd like you rather to say whether you're a peach or a coconut. What are the British? Do you think we're more like peaches when it comes to relationships, or are we more coconutty? Wonderful. I think everyone's probably voted who's going to, so let me share the answers. So hopefully you can see that, but it's very much in favour of the coconut. We've got about 78% saying coconut and 21% saying the peach. So I can see a couple of people are typing, and I can see a couple of people maybe don't know what I mean. That's because I haven't explained it yet. But perhaps can anyone explain what we mean by a peach and a coconut when it comes to relationships? Is anyone going to be brave? So, it's a little bit of a cheesy analogy, but yes, it's kind of the hard shell. The coconut, when it comes to making relationships, is quite hard to crack. You really can't get very far. You're knocking on the door, on the shell, and you just can't get in. It takes a long time to break through that hard exterior. But then after time, we know it takes time, you get through that exterior, and it's quite soft inside. There's lots of space, it's fluid, and it's easy. It's very, very, very soft, very fluffy. The peach, as some of you I can see are saying, it's soft on the outside, it's sweet, but what's inside? There's a very hard kernel. So it's quite hard to really get through to that inner relationship, that deeper relationship. Now, I know this is a very cliched analogy, but I think most people would agree that the Brits are more of a coconut. It's hard to get to know them, but once you do, you can make really long lasting, deeper relationships. And that comes for business as well as the personal setting. The peach, I think often people use the US, the United States, as an example of a peachy culture. Very smiley, great customer service, very friendly on the outside. But actually to get to know people in a deep way is very hard over there, from my experience and also what I've heard. Of course, there are other cultures that perhaps are soft on the outside and the inside, and we don't unfortunately have a fruit for you. But hopefully you get the picture now and you see the analogy. Has that been your experience of building perhaps business relationships with British people? Well, feel free to chat, but I'll move on through the slides. So another question for you. Let me show you on the slide, and this has come from listening to many expats telling me this same story. So you're in a work context and a colleague comes up to you and says, yeah, Esther Marie, I'm sure it always depends on the people, doesn't it? And the industry as well, but I guess when we generalise, as we do with cultural averages, we tend to look at the Brits in that way. So your British colleague suggests you have lunch sometime. You've got a number of different answers, and I'll let you vote on the poll. So here you have the same questions. You need to choose which answer you think would... I'm sorry, bear with me. That is the next one. Let's just... Here we go. That looks more like it. So I'll give you just a few more seconds to vote. People seem to be changing their minds. Aha, interesting. So, I'm not sure if you can see that, but an overwhelming majority has voted for the third answer, so that would be lovely. A few have said, how about next Wednesday? Now, I ask you this because, like I say, I've had a number of expats I've worked with say, I don't understand. People ask me to have lunch, but they have no intention of ever having lunch with me. Why do they say it? And I have to say, that wouldn't be my style personally, but I think there's an awkwardness about building relationships with many British people, and we say the right thing. It's a great way to end the conversation. Oh yeah, it'd be lovely to have lunch next next year sometime, now that we're in the Christmas season. But unfortunately, it's not always 100% a realistic offer. It's often something that we say to close the conversation down. So perhaps to be too enthusiastic might not get the right response. So much better to have, as you mostly said, a much vaguer answer. It's, oh yeah, that would be lovely. That would be great. Let's be in touch next year, or I'll be in touch at some point to fix something up. It's not that we don't mean it. It's not that we're being hypocritical, as we mentioned before. It's just that easing out of the conversation and trying to say the right thing without perhaps giving it too much thought. So let's look in a little bit more detail about communication. And I think particularly when working with the British, what's important sometimes is what's not being said as much as what is being said. So I don't know whether in your experience any of these, I'm not going to go through them one by one, but which of these have caused challenge or discomfort for you when interacting with British colleagues or partners? Where have you found the gaps in expectations or the difference in communication styles? Perhaps you can use the annotation to mark on the slide. Lovely, thank you. Or otherwise you can just note something down in the chat. So no surprises, the indirectness is a big thing for some of you. Formality is interesting, and I wonder if it's because there's an assumption that the British culture is very formal, and actually we're not that formal. So that mismatch between the expectation and the reality. Gosh, it seems like most of the elements have some level of challenge, but the humour, again, no surprise. Comfort with interruption. I'm curious, is that we interrupt more than you would like, or we're not comfortable when you interrupt? And again, it depends where in the world you're coming from. I would say we do tend to interrupt perhaps more than some cultures, but not as much as others. I'm hedging my bets a little bit with that one. But interesting, I think, the whole range of areas where there are potential challenges. And I think it's important here that you think about your own culture, your own communication style, and then you can sort of realize where those potential touch points, those potential challenges might be. But I think time and time and again for us, what comes up is the indirectness. So let me ask you one final quiz. So your colleague, you're asking your colleague to get something done, and you want that guarantee that it's going to happen. What would make you feel most comfortable, most confident that it actually is going to get done? Which of these responses would fill you with a quiet confidence that they're on it? Is it working? I think it's working now. Thank you, Sammy. Is it working now? Great. Lovely. So no clear answer here, and I think that's very interesting because, in all honesty, I would say that none of these answers would fill me with a huge amount of confidence. Certainly if someone said it's on my list, I wouldn't be feeling too optimistic. Probably, in all honesty, leave it with me is the one that I would feel the most confident. But it's not a given. And I'm sure you've seen these kind of things before, but let's just have a quick look. And I think if you can learn how to decode what the British really mean, that's probably the greatest skill you can develop for your relationships with partners here in the UK. The first one there is mine from many years ago when I was a regular intercultural trainer going into companies around the country, delivering one-day programs, working with different groups. And I'd walk into the room, didn't know anyone, and my instinct would be to say, "Oh, it's really warm in here, isn't it?" And the group in the room would shiver in their jumpers and say, "No, not really." And I'd think, that's really annoying. I'm so warm. And I was trying to ask them to open the window. and they haven't really responded in the way that I hoped. And I am, hands up, I am very indirect, but I've learned now that if I want the window open, I actually have to say, can you open the window for me? It's not rocket science, but it's a sign of how indirect we can sometimes be. So quite an interesting idea might mean actually don't like it at all. Can I make a suggestion? Probably means I'm going to tell you how you need to do it and when by. So we don't always tell it like it is. So you really need to learn to read the subtext. And that's where some of those non-verbal elements come in. If you can read the air, as I think they say in Japan, and actually understand what we're not saying, it will stand you in good stead. And I think this is where we're very different from our friends in the USA who speak the same language, but in a very different way. Here in the UK, it's all about modifying our language using downgraders. So it's not bad. It's quite nice. It's fairly interesting. Whereas those of you who've spent time in the UK will know it's absolutely amazing, fantastic, phenomenal. So the use of language is very different. And I actually think sometimes if someone says to you that something's not bad at all, that's pretty good. So often we'll actually use a negative to make a positive. So just something to be aware of. So yeah, that not bad at all thing is almost as good as saying something's excellent for some of us Brits. And I think if we're talking about communication in the workplace, we really need to at least touch on the fairly thorny sometimes topic of how we give feedback. As in most organisations, feedback is given and it's expected, but we find it incredibly difficult. I think due to our indirectness, our need to save face almost to preserve the harmony, not rock the boat, as some people say. So when you are giving feedback, those of you who manage British team members, it's really important to give the positive as well as the negative. We do value praise here, and we like to celebrate success, particularly on behalf of our colleagues, behalf of our teams. So we don't shout about our own successes, but it is important if you're a manager to share the successes among your team and with your broader team about the triumphs, the good things that your team have been achieving. So I think it's tricky because there's a danger if we soften our feedback, I'm sure some of you are familiar with that concept of the feedback sandwich. Feedback can get lost. So it's finding that balance between giving the constructive feedback in a firm but friendly way, and then perhaps reinforcing with some of that positive affirmation as well. And I think I've just got that last bullet, sort of taking it out of the workplace. We do struggle here with making complaints, and there is a tolerance. Certainly if there is anyone on the call from the States, our customer service is quite questionable, I think, sometimes here in the UK. I'm not sure what your experiences are. But let's start to wrap up now, because I'm aware of time and I'm very keen to make sure we do have some time for questions at the end. So, I mean, I'm not going to read the slide out for you, but just some key themes and takeaways for you in terms of tips really to make whether it's a 2-year expatriation in the UK, or it's a 2-day business visit, or it's a half-an-hour conference call with colleagues over here, what can you do to make sure it's successful? And I think some of these bullet points actually are around working internationally as much as working with the British. So curiosity is something that I'm a great advocate of. Always ask questions about the culture, but also don't be afraid to ask if you don't know, if you don't understand. I think most of these things we've talked about already, but I think the final one is probably the most important, that need to learn to crack the code and really understand what we're not saying as well as what we are saying. So Rosie, I don't know if you want to come back and we can just hopefully allow some time for some questions, some discussion. Feel free to disagree, to give me feedback on anything I've said in a nice, soft way, of course. But we'd love to have your questions, your comments. You there, Rosie?
Yes.
Hi.
So the on the last slide, one thing that I thought was interesting was the need for personal space
Mm-hmm.
and privacy, which I really, really agree with. But I think at the same time, the eye contact is just so important as well.
Yes.
So it's getting a
Yes.
balance between we want the personal relationship because we want the eye contact, but we also need to give each other some space, and that's quite a
Yes.
difficult balance.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I would say firm eye contact, firm handshake. And it's interesting, I do a lot of training with British people who are working internationally, and we talk about the same elements of communication. And I'll often ask, what does it mean to you if someone doesn't make eye contact? And time again, British people will say, I can't trust them. I think they're shifty. I think they're lying. They're not honest. So that's the impact if you don't make eye contact with a Brit. So yeah, no, that's really interesting. So Thomas has asked what other areas a longer course would cover. We go into a lot more detail about the areas we have covered. We'll spend time looking at the values in depth and then how they translate into some of the cross-cultural theory, which I haven't really spoken about today. So we'll look at, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with people like Hofstede and Trompenaars, who've looked at how cultures, how they have a relationship with things like hierarchy, group work, attitudes to risk, attitudes to time, go into a lot more detail about how that impacts on you, whether you're managing, working with, being managed by. We spend more time looking at real life examples. So we'll have things like case studies, scenarios where something's gone wrong, perhaps. But I think one thing that we haven't talked about, which we include in all of our courses without exception, is how do you maximize the positives of working with people from different cultures. So looking at the benefits, what does the other culture bring? So we certainly touch on that. The other thing is how you develop your own cultural intelligence. What do I mean by that? Give you the skills that will help you here in the UK, but also help you working globally. And I guess leading on from that, if you are working here in London, it is a microcosm of the world. So having the skills to be able to work not only with British people, but with people from all over the world is an important part of working with the British. Just looking and seeing if there are any other questions. Somebody made a comment similar to the German culture. And I wondered what elements and what you meant by that. Crack the code, Esther Marie, is really what I mean by that is the non-verbal code. So how do you interpret what we're not saying? So if I say that's a fantastic idea, how do you learn to crack the code behind that and what I really mean? Yes, thank you for that comment, Stefan. We're looking at a schedule of webinars for next year. So we certainly have done some country-specific themes before, but we'll take that feedback and look at what we can offer for next year. Let's have a look.
Can I just jump in here, Kathy? Because
Please.
I'm just having a little almost side conversation in the chat here. And I think there is still something that people find quite difficult is this cracking the code to really understand what we mean when we say something. So Yolanda said, where was it? After a conversation, the other person will say, I think this is probably like that. And Yolanda's wondering whether we are agreeing or disagreeing when we say something like that. And I think there's the side of we're probably agreeing, but it's always worth checking if there's
Yes.
something that we're not saying. So it's always worth asking after a comment
Yes.
like that. You know, is there anything else?
Absolutely, and I think that comes back to any kind of cross-cultural interactions, the danger of making assumptions, and it's fine to say, can I just clarify? You know, certainly when we were talking about meetings, let's just recap, let's be clear on the actions, let's be clear what's been agreed, and even using humour and saying, I'm from another culture. I'm from XY country. I'm not sure if I've understood. Can I just clarify? I think it's fine to say that. Yeah. So.
I think so. We're aware that we are indirect. So sometimes we need help in becoming
Yes.
more direct.
Absolutely.
Invitation just to actually say how we feel.
Yes, and it's hand in hand with building the relationship, isn't it? And I think. As we get to know each other, we name some of our, I will always tell people I'm very indirect, and you can almost make a joke about it, and you can say, oh, forgive my indirectness. I have other colleagues who will say, well, it's my direct way. And once we have that relationship, and also the language of cross-cultural communication can help us to use labels that aren't, rude or disrespectful. They're just different preferences.
I think that's one of the interesting things I've really enjoyed from your webinar today was recognising myself on the slide as a Brit and realising that this is not how everybody is. Obviously, this is a trait that I can relate to, and almost seeing how ridiculous some of the traits are.
Yes, but it is sometimes an ability to laugh at ourselves and not take ourselves too seriously. So. Well, thank you, everyone. That's a really rich conversation. And I know people have already had to leave for their next meetings and so on. But if you have any questions, any comments, I think you know where both of us are. So do feel free to carry on the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you again, everybody, for joining and for being so interactive. It's been really, really interesting watching the chat go through, and we'll read it again with interest at the end. Like I say, we will follow up with the recording so that you can keep some of the interesting ideas with you. While we were talking today about British culture, I would like to say that the London School of International Communication has a network of trainers who are experts in many, many different cultures. So whatever culture you are working with or going to start working with, we can also help you kind of understand and become successful with a lot of different cultures. So please do get in touch if you have any particular business training needs for different cultures. We can do training virtually or face-to-face. And we also have, if you want more about the British culture specifically, in London we run one-day public training courses. And just aside from that, we also have courses in combination with language, with the English language. So there's many, many different training courses if you would like anything along these lines. So please get in touch with myself or with Kathy. That's my details at the end here. So yeah, I'd be very happy to hear from you. And thank you very much, Kathy, for what I thought was
my
brilliant.
pleasure. Thank you, Rosie. And yeah, just stay in touch. We'd love to carry on talking to you. We'll be announcing next year's webinars soon. So look out for those emails, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one.
Okay.
All right. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the day. Enjoy your holidays, those of you who have them, and see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.